What you're about to hear is not just a story about Iran, not just a headline about missiles, politics, or war. This is about something far deeper, something the world rarely shows you. It's about a moment when truth broke through the noise, when a powerful man, Donald Trump, finally said what others were afraid to admit. Iran struck Israel hard, and what followed wasn't chaos, it was clarity. The streets of Tehran didn't erupt in hate. They lit up with pride, with unity, with a fire the world thought had burned out long ago. This video isn't made to entertain, it's made to awaken, to open your eyes to a reality the media filters, to a strength that no one expected, and to a celebration that wasn't about destruction, but about reclaiming dignity after decades of being told to kneel. From the skies above to the hearts below, something changed that day. And if you watch closely, if you feel every word, you'll realize this isn't just Iran's story. This might just be yours too. So don't skip, don't scroll, sit with this, let it speak to you, because by the time this ends, you won't just understand what happened, you'll understand why it mattered. Let's begin. When Donald Trump, a figure known for his boldness and unapologetic stance, publicly admitted that Iran struck Israel hard, it wasn't just a statement, it was a shift. A moment that broke through the fog of politics and media spin. For years, Iran had been painted as the underdog, the isolated nation boxed in by sanctions and pressure, a target too afraid to retaliate. But that single admission flipped the script. It revealed something the world had refused to see, that Iran had the capability, the will, and the precision to strike back when provoked. And not just strike, but strike in a way that forced even its greatest adversaries to acknowledge the impact. This wasn't a leaked report or a quiet rumor. It came from a man who once led the world's most powerful nation. And when he said it openly, clearly, it carried weight far beyond headlines. It shook the image of a Middle East dominated by one-sided power. Suddenly, Iran was no longer just reacting. It was commanding attention, setting terms, and drawing lines that couldn't be ignored. Trump's words weren't just unexpected, they were historic. Because when a voice known for siding against you admits you hit hard, the world listens differently. That moment put respect on Iran's name, not just among its allies, but also among neutral observers who had believed the narrative that it was cornered and incapable. Trump, knowingly or not, handed Iran a political and psychological victory. He revealed to the global stage that Tehran is not just surviving pressure, it's responding to it with strength. And more importantly, that strength is being recognized even by its loudest critics. In the world of global politics, perception is power. And perception changed the day those words were spoken. The man who once ordered the assassination of an Iranian general now stood before the world acknowledging the power of the nation he once tried to intimidate. That irony wasn't lost on Tehran. And it certainly wasn't lost on the millions across the region who saw that admission as more than truth. It was a turning point. A moment that confirmed Iran's resilience is no longer a theory, it's reality, recognized by the very voice that once tried to silence it. Iran's strike was more than just a military operation. It was a psychological awakening. It wasn't just about firing missiles or hitting a target. It was about sending a message loud enough to echo across every screen, every border, every closed-door discussion in powerful capitals. The strike was calculated, precise, and timed to show that Iran wasn't reacting out of rage, but responding with strategy. It told the world, we are not afraid. and we are not asleep. For decades, Iran had been seen by many as a cornered nation, speaking in defiance but bound by its limitations. Yet this moment proved that its silence was never weakness, it was discipline. When those missiles launched, they didn't just fly through the sky. They tore through the illusion that Iran was incapable of action. It was a direct challenge to a global order that had grown too comfortable treating some nations as invincible and others as invisible. The psychological weight of the strike hit harder than the physical damage. It forced leaders, analysts, and even ordinary people across the world to reconsider their assumptions. Iran, long painted as the one being hunted, had suddenly become the hunter, calm, focused, and unapologetically bold. This wasn't about destruction for the sake of revenge. It was about showing presence. Iran didn't strike in chaos. It struck with clarity. It struck to remind the world that deterrence goes both ways, that for every act of aggression, there may come a day of reckoning, and that day had arrived. The psychological effect was immediate. Israel's airspace, usually seen as a fortress, had been penetrated, and in that moment, the myth of untouchability cracked. The silence in war rooms and the urgency in media coverage wasn't just about damage reports. It was about the realization that the narrative had changed. And while the world scrambled for statements, Iran stood firm, not boasting wildly, but letting the action speak for itself. It knew what it had done. It didn't need headlines to validate it, because the real impact wasn't in the rubble, it was in the fear it planted in those who thought Iran would always hold back. That shift in mindset, that sudden reevaluation of power, was the real victory. The psychological ground had moved, and the world felt it. When the missiles landed and the world paused, something powerful unfolded in the streets of Tehran. It wasn't a celebration of war or destruction. It was a celebration of pride, of long-held dignity finally standing tall. For years, Iran had been cast as the one who only endured, never responded. It was the nation that mourned its martyrs quietly, bore its sanctions patiently, and held its anger in check while being called the aggressor. But that night, when Tehran's skies lit up, not from explosions, but from fireworks, it marked a shift in the spirit of the people. It was a statement. We are still here, we are still standing, and we are no longer silent. The celebration wasn't fueled by hatred, it was driven by years of humiliation turned into strength. People poured into the streets not to chant war, but to express something deeper, that the world finally saw them, that for once Iran had spoken a language everyone understood: action. That moment reminded the world that national pride doesn't come from rhetoric alone, but from resilience rewarded. The people of Iran had endured assassination, sabotage, isolation, and economic warfare, but through it all they held their line. And when they finally answered back with strength and strategy, it felt like a collective breath had been released. In Tehran that night, fathers looked their sons in the eye with quiet confidence. Mothers who had wept for decades of struggle smiled knowing their country had not bowed. The streets didn't just echo with chants, they pulsed with unity. It was a rare moment where politics, religion, and generations came together, not in grief, but in strength. The youth danced, the elders watched with tears, because they knew what it had cost to reach this point, not just in weapons, but in patience, in sacrifice, in faith. This wasn't about a single strike. It was about reclaiming something far more valuable than land or power. It was about restoring belief in a nation's ability to stand tall and in a people's right to feel seen. The celebrations weren't about destruction. They were about recognition. A confirmation that Iran's silence all these years hadn't been surrender, it had been strategy. And when it finally spoke, it made sure the world heard every word. The response from Iran didn't just reveal its strength, it exposed a long-standing hypocrisy in global politics. When certain nations fire missiles, the world calls it defense. When others respond, suddenly it's aggression. When powerful Western allies launch strikes, the media calls it precision. But when Iran defends itself, the headlines shift to escalation. That double standard didn't begin with this latest conflict, but this time it was too obvious to ignore. The contrast between how Israel's actions were justified and how Iran's retaliation was condemned drew a line in the sand, and people across the globe began to see through the narrative. This key moment wasn't just about military power, it was about moral clarity. Iran's response wasn't random. It was calculated, following repeated provocations and aggressions. And when it finally answered back, the world didn't just react to the missiles, it reacted to who launched them. That's where the hypocrisy lies. It's not in what happened, but in who is allowed to do it. Some nations are handed a permanent permission slip to act, while others are warned, sanctioned, and demonized before they even lift a finger. This situation exposed the uncomfortable truth many global leaders avoid. Not all nations are treated equally, even in war. The media's framing, the diplomatic responses, and the selective outrage revealed a bias too big to hide. But this time, the world didn't just swallow the script. Social media, independent voices, and a more informed global audience pushed back. People began to question why justice seems to change depending on the flag being flown. They began to ask why some victims are mourned and others ignored, why some strikes are cheered and others condemned, even when both come from the same cycle of violence. Iran's move and the reaction to it ripped the mask off a system that has always played favorites. It forced people to look at the rules of the game and see how they shift depending on who's playing. That clarity might not change policies overnight, but it planted a seed of awareness. And once people see the truth, it's hard to unsee it. Iran didn't just strike with missiles, it struck at the double standards that have shielded power for too long. And in doing so, it helped redraw the line between power and principle. When the world measures strength, it often counts missiles, tanks, and fighter jets. But the true power of a nation isn't just in its weaponry, it's in its will. Iran's most formidable weapon has never been what flies through the air, but what beats in the hearts of its people. The strike that shook Israel may have made headlines, but the real shock was how deeply it reflected a spirit rooted in unbreakable faith. Decades of pressure, threats, and isolation have tried to break that spirit, but it has only grown stronger, more disciplined, more focused. Because in Iran, faith is not a private ritual, it's a national identity, a source of endurance, and a shield against despair. While others rely on foreign support and military alliances, Iran relies on its belief system. That doesn't mean it lacks strategy. It means its strategy is shaped by conviction. Its people have learned to endure, to wait, to sacrifice, not because they are weak, but because they are connected to a cause that runs deeper than politics. That cause is rooted in the belief that justice will prevail, even if it comes late. The patience of a faithful nation isn't passivity, it's preparation. It's the ability to hold fire not because you can't act, but because you know when to strike means everything. This spiritual foundation isn't just about religion, it's about a worldview, a belief that strength doesn't always look like domination. Sometimes it looks like resistance. Sometimes it looks like rebuilding a life after war. Sometimes it looks like holding your values while the world tells you to abandon them. And when Iran struck back with precision and purpose, it was more than a military response. It was a reflection of everything they had been quietly preparing for, a test of faith met with action, not just words. The celebration in the streets of Tehran was not fueled by hate, but by the realization that belief had turned into reality. That after years of restraint, when Iran did speak through force, it did so with clarity, not chaos. The power behind that strike wasn't just metal and fire, it was years of prayer, patience, and unshaken identity. That kind of power doesn't come from labs or factories. It comes from the soul of a people who never stopped believing that one day the world would see them not just as survivors, but as standing unbowed and ready. What happened between Iran and Israel wasn't just a regional event. It was a message that traveled far beyond borders, reaching oppressed people around the globe who had waited in silence for someone, somewhere, to push back against injustice. And Iran launched its response and stood its ground with clarity and defiance. The act echoed through lands still colonized in spirit, through nations bruised by occupation, and through communities that have long been told to accept their suffering quietly. The celebration in Tehran wasn't just a national moment, it was symbolic. It sent a signal to the world that resistance is not dead, that silence does not equal surrender, and that justice is still alive in places the world tries to ignore. This key moment carried more weight than military strategy. It revived something emotional and spiritual in the hearts of people who have spent lifetimes under pressure. It reminded them that even against overwhelming odds, even when the narrative is controlled, the economy strangled, and the military outgunned, strength can still rise, not from sheer force, but from belief, purpose, and timing. Iran's response wasn't just about itself. It was a torch held high for others in darkness. And when people from Palestine to Yemen, from Kashmir to Lebanon saw the news, they didn't just see an airstrike. They saw validation. They saw someone saying enough. The global reaction showed that this moment wasn't isolated. It sparked discussions in cafes, debates in universities, prayers in mosques, and even unease in parliaments. It reminded the powerful that there are still nations willing to challenge the status quo, not out of recklessness, but out of duty. This wasn't a cry for war. It was a refusal to accept endless injustice without reply. It gave the voiceless a sense of representation, even if for a moment, and that moment matters. Because when hope is ignited, even by a single event, it can travel like wildfire through the hearts of those who have nothing left but dignity. Iran's move served as a mirror to the world, reflecting both the failure of silence and the strength of defiance. It didn't end oppression overnight, but it reminded the oppressed that they're not alone. It reminded tyrants that no one stays down forever, and it reminded all of us that sometimes the most powerful message isn't in the destruction itself. It's in the courage to respond when the world says you shouldn't. In a world where power often comes wrapped in arrogance and injustice hides behind polished headlines, Iran's response was more than just retaliation. It was a revelation that showed the oppressed can still rise, the silence can still speak, and the underestimated can still shape the powerful. When Trump admitted the truth, when the world heard that Iran struck hard, it was more than a confession, it was confirmation. Confirmation that patience is not weakness, that faith is not fantasy, and that a nation built on belief cannot be broken by force. Tehran didn't celebrate war, it celebrated dignity. It celebrated the moment the tables turned, not just politically, but spiritually. Because when missiles fall and the people still rise, when they still smile, still walk with pride, still believe in justice, they are declaring something no military can defeat. They are declaring that victory isn't always in land gained, but in identity reclaimed. And this message, this roar from the streets of Tehran, it's for every soul still fighting to be heard, every land still struggling to be free, every heart still choosing courage when surrender would be easier. Good luck and thank you message. Thank you for watching, for listening with an open mind, and for staying until the very last word. In a world full of noise, your attention is powerful. May your heart stay guided by truth. May your courage always outshine fear. And may your voice echo where silence once ruled. Good luck on your journey, and never forget, real strength isn't in how loud you fight, it's in how deeply you believe. Peace and blessings to you all.